There is an irony in all of this. The person who desperately searches for signs is often the person least able to receive their psychological meaning. Why? Because desperation already contains an answer. You are not really asking, what does this experience reveal? You are asking, will this confirm what I want? Will they come back? Should I leave? Will I succeed? Is this person meant for me? Am I making the right decision? Is something good about to happen? The mind wants certainty. And this is where the search for signs can become psychologically dangerous. Because uncertainty does not merely make us uncomfortable. It exposes the limits of the ego. It reminds us that we cannot control another person's feelings, the timing of an opportunity, the future of a relationship, or the outcome of every decision. When the ego cannot control what comes next, it often tries to control the meaning of what is happening now. So it starts collecting evidence.
A song appears at the right moment. A number repeats. A name appears twice in one day. Someone says the exact sentence you were thinking about. And suddenly the event is no longer simply interesting. It becomes emotionally loaded. It becomes part of a private case you are building in your mind. See, you tell yourself, this must mean something. And perhaps it does. But there is an important difference between something having psychological meaning and something giving you a literal prediction. That difference can change everything. A coincidence may reveal what your attention is organized around without telling you what will happen next. A dream may reveal a conflict without giving you an instruction. A powerful emotional reaction may reveal an old wound without proving that the person in front of you is responsible for all of it. The mature question is not whether meaning exists. The mature question is what kind of meaning you are dealing with. Jung was deeply interested in the strange borderland where inner experience and outer event sometimes seem to meet. But that interest was never an invitation to abandon discernment. The psyche is symbolic. Symbols do not always speak in literal sentences. They compress emotion, memory, instinct, fear, desire, and possibility into images that can feel larger than ordinary thought. This is why a symbol can affect you before you understand it. You see an empty house in a dream and wake with grief. You hear a stranger describe a life you secretly want and feel exposed. You repeatedly notice a certain theme during a period of transition and cannot explain why it grips you. The experience may matter, but the first responsibility is not obedience. It is observation. What did this touch in you? What desire became visible? What fear became active? What possibilities suddenly felt real? What part of your current identity felt threatened? Those questions move you from superstition toward consciousness. And they also protect you from one of the most seductive tendencies of the human mind: using symbols to avoid reality. Sometimes we prefer a sign because reality is giving us an answer we do not want. The person is inconsistent, but we focus on the song that played after we thought of them. The job is destroying our health, but we focus on a motivational quote that appeared at 11:11. The relationship has become emotionally unsafe, but we keep interpreting dreams instead of looking at behavior. The opportunity is real, but we refuse to act until the universe gives us one more confirmation. In each case, the sign becomes a delay. It allows us to remain between knowing and acting. And that middle space can feel strangely safe. You can keep hoping without deciding. You can keep analyzing without grieving. You can keep interpreting without changing. But consciousness eventually asks for something interpretation cannot replace: a response. And uncertainty can be painful. So we begin turning the world into a system of reassurance. A coincidence becomes confirmation. A dream becomes prediction. A symbol becomes instruction. But Jung's psychology points towards something far more mature. The purpose of becoming conscious is not to eliminate uncertainty. It is to become someone capable of living consciously inside uncertainty. That changes the entire relationship with signs.
Instead of asking the external world to constantly reassure you, you begin developing an internal capacity to observe. You notice what repeats. You notice what activates you. You notice what you dream. You notice what you project. You notice where your energy goes. You notice what you repeatedly avoid. And gradually, you begin understanding your own psychological language. Then something interesting happens. You need fewer dramatic signs because you recognize the pattern earlier. You no longer need the fifth emotionally unavailable relationship to understand what is happening. You notice the familiar attraction in the beginning. You no longer need complete exhaustion before recognizing that you have abandoned your boundaries. You feel yourself doing it. You no longer need life to collapse before admitting that something has become psychologically unsustainable. You notice the tension. You no longer need another person to become the villain before recognizing your projection. You catch yourself placing something onto them. The unconscious does not necessarily become silent. You become better at listening. And perhaps that is one of the deepest purposes of all these experiences. Not to make you dependent on signs, but to make you more conscious of yourself. Imagine that something inside you has been asking for attention for a very long time. At first, it is subtle. A little dissatisfaction, a recurring dream, an uncomfortable reaction, a desire you quickly dismiss, a boundary you know you should establish, a truth you almost admit to yourself. Then you suppress it. Life continues. The signal returns. You suppress it again. Eventually, the psychological tension may increase. The dream becomes more vivid. The resentment becomes stronger. The same conflict repeats. Your energy decreases. You begin feeling disconnected from your own life. You tell yourself, I don't know what's wrong with me. But perhaps something in you has been trying to answer that question for years. This does not mean every psychological difficulty is caused by ignoring the unconscious. Human suffering is far more complex than that. But there are times when prolonged inner conflict is intensified because the conscious personality refuses to acknowledge what has become psychologically necessary. Perhaps you know the relationship is built around a version of yourself you can no longer sustain. Perhaps you know you have spent years pursuing someone else's definition of success. Perhaps you know your kindness has become self-abandonment. Perhaps you know your independence has become emotional isolation. Perhaps you know the identity everyone admires is exhausting you. And perhaps you have known for much longer than you admit. The unconscious often does not introduce completely foreign information. In fact, one of the most unsettling discoveries in psychological work is how often the thing we call a revelation is actually a recognition. You knew something before you were willing to say that you knew it. You knew when the conversation changed. You knew when you began shrinking yourself. You knew when your enthusiasm disappeared. You knew when admiration became resentment. You knew when a dream stopped feeling like a strange image and began feeling like a mirror. But the conscious personality had reasons to look away. Maybe admitting the truth would disappoint your family. Maybe it would force you to question years of effort. Maybe it would mean grieving a person who is still physically present. Maybe it would challenge the identity you built around being strong, useful, loyal, spiritual, successful, rational, independent, or good. The ego does not resist truth only because truth is painful. Sometimes it resists because truth is expensive. It may cost belonging. It may cost certainty. It may cost the version of yourself that other people understand. It may cost a future you spent years imagining. This is why repetition becomes so important. What returns is often what has not yet been integrated. The same emotional pattern appears with different people. The same fear appears in different opportunities. The same dream changes costumes, but preserves the same feeling. The same resentment emerges every time someone expresses a quality you deny in yourself. The same kind of relationship begins with fascination and ends with depletion. At first, we blame the circumstances. Then we blame the people. Then, if we become curious enough, we begin noticing the structure. What is the common element here? What role do I keep entering? What do I repeatedly tolerate? What do I repeatedly chase? What do I repeatedly fear? What do I repeatedly refuse to say? This does not mean turning every painful experience into self-blame. That would be another distortion. There are things done to us that are not caused by our psychology. There are betrayals, losses, accidents, illnesses, and forms of harm that cannot be reduced to an inner pattern. Psychological responsibility is not the same as total responsibility. The question is not, what did I do to deserve this? The question is, what part of this experience belongs to my conscious work now?
That is a much more humane question. It recognizes reality without surrendering agency. And sometimes the answer is very small. You need to admit that you are tired. You need to stop calling fear intuition. You need to stop calling self-abandonment love. You need to stop calling avoidance peace. You need to stop calling obsession a sign. You need to stop calling numbness strength. Language matters because the name you give an experience determines what you believe you can do with it. When the name changes, the possibilities change. And this is one reason the unconscious can feel relentless. It keeps placing pressure on the language of the conscious mind. It keeps exposing where your explanation no longer fits your life. You say you are fine, but you keep dreaming of being trapped. You say you want the promotion, but every step toward it produces dread. You say you have moved on, but your imagination is still organized around being seen by the person who left. You say you want freedom, but you repeatedly choose situations that require permission. The contradiction is not a verdict, it is an invitation. Something in you is divided, and what is divided cannot become whole by pretending one side does not exist. Sometimes it keeps returning you to what you already know, but refuse to know fully. That is a very different idea of a sign. The sign is not revealing the future. It is revealing the present you have not yet accepted. And acceptance can be terrifying, because once you admit what you know, you may have to respond. As long as you remain confused, you can remain still. Once something becomes conscious, responsibility enters. That is why we sometimes prefer endless interpretation. We analyze the dream, analyze the coincidence, analyze the relationship, analyze the symbol, again and again. But eventually the question becomes simpler. What have I already understood that I am afraid to act upon? Sometimes that question ends years of psychological noise. There is another form of information people frequently ignore: the body. This needs to be understood carefully. Physical symptoms can have many causes and should not automatically be interpreted psychologically. But emotional states also have bodily expressions. You enter a certain environment and your body tightens. You speak with someone and notice that you are holding your breath. You prepare to say yes to something and feel immediate resistance. You are around certain people and become unusually exhausted because you are constantly monitoring yourself. Then you leave and something relaxes. Again, this is not proof. A bodily sensation is not a supernatural verdict, but it can be information worth including. Sometimes your conscious story says, everything is fine, while your behavior and emotional responses tell a different story. You say, I can be myself around them. But before every conversation, you carefully calculate what you are allowed to say. You say, I love this job. But Sunday evening fills you with dread every week. You say, I've forgiven them. But every mention of their name produces an emotional storm. You say, I don't care what people think. But almost every important choice is still organized around how it will be perceived. The contradiction is information. And contradictions are often where the shadow becomes visible. The shadow is not simply the dark, immoral, or frightening part of the personality. It also contains qualities you learned not to express because they threatened belonging. Your anger may be in the shadow because anger was punished.
Your ambition may be in the shadow because wanting more was called selfish. Your softness may be in the shadow because vulnerability was unsafe. Your sexuality may be in the shadow because desire was shamed. Your authority may be in the shadow because speaking confidently made other people uncomfortable. Your need for rest may be in the shadow because your worth was tied to productivity. When a quality is pushed out of conscious identity, it does not disappear. It often returns indirectly. You become fascinated by people who express it. You become irritated by people who express it. You idealize them. You judge them. You envy them. You obsess over them. This is projection. Something that belongs partly to your own psychological world is experienced as if it exists only in the other person. Projection can make attraction feel like destiny. It can make irritation feel like moral clarity. It can make admiration feel supernatural. This is why certain people seem to carry an almost impossible charge. You meet someone and feel as though you have known them forever. Perhaps there is genuine compatibility. Perhaps there is also projection. You meet someone and immediately distrust them. Perhaps your perception is accurate. Perhaps they also carry a trait you have rejected in yourself. Both possibilities can exist. Maturity does not force a single explanation. It increases your capacity to hold complexity. Instead of asking, "Is this person good or bad?" you ask, "What is actually happening between us? And what is also happening inside me?" Instead of asking, "Is this attraction a sign that we are meant to be together?" you ask, "What does this person awaken in me that has been dormant?" Instead of asking, "Why does their confidence bother me so much?" you ask, "Where did I learn that I was not allowed to take up space?" This is where a relationship can become psychologically meaningful, even when it does not become permanent. Some people enter your life and remain. Others enter your life and expose a hidden structure. They reveal the wound you keep protecting, the desire you keep postponing, the identity you have outgrown, the boundary you have never learned to hold, the unlived part of your personality. That does not make every painful relationship sacred. It does not mean you should remain in harmful situations because you are learning something. Sometimes the lesson is precisely that you can leave. Sometimes growth is not staying long enough to understand the other person. It is recognizing yourself soon enough to stop abandoning yourself. This is one of the most important shifts in shadow work. You stop asking only, "Why are they doing this to me?" And you also ask, "Why am I remaining in a position where this repeatedly becomes possible?" Again, not as blame, as consciousness. Because the moment you can see your position in a pattern, you may discover an exit that was invisible while you were focused only on the other person. And Jungian work is filled with contradictions because consciousness often identifies with the story it prefers. The unconscious reveals what the story excludes. This is why becoming conscious can initially feel like becoming less certain. You begin noticing that your explanations are incomplete. You say, "I stayed because I loved them." Maybe. And perhaps also because leaving activated abandonment. "I worked that hard because I was ambitious." Perhaps. And maybe achievement was also your way of securing worth. "I helped because I'm compassionate." Yes, and perhaps being needed also protected you from feeling unnecessary. Multiple motives can coexist. Psychological maturity allows them to. You do not need to destroy the noble motive because another motive exists beneath it. You simply become less naive about yourself. And the less naive you become, the less easily unconscious motives can disguise themselves as destiny. Imagine that you are going through one of the most uncertain periods of your life. Your old direction no longer feels right, but no new direction has fully appeared. You ask for certainty. Nothing comes. Then one day you encounter something unexpectedly. A book, a conversation, a person, a symbol, a sentence. It does not tell you, "And this is important," because the ego often wants the unconscious to function like an oracle. "Tell me who to choose. Tell me where to go." Tell me whether I will fail. Tell me whether they will return. Tell me what happens next. But the deeper psyche does not always cooperate with that demand. Sometimes it gives you an image instead of an answer. A locked door, a flooded room, a child you cannot find, a road that disappears, an animal watching from the edge of a forest, a house with rooms you have never entered. These images may feel frustrating because they do not resolve uncertainty. They intensify it. But perhaps that is precisely their value. A direct answer can leave your consciousness unchanged. A symbol asks you to participate. You have to sit with it, associate to it. Notice the emotion. Notice what changes when you imagine different meanings. Notice where the image touches your biography. A house, for example, can carry an enormous range of meanings. Safety, family, identity, the body, the self, memory, privacy, a life you built, a life you want to leave. There is no universal dictionary that can tell you what your house means with certainty. The meaning emerges through relationship. Your relationship to the image, your relationship to your life, your relationship to the emotional situation in which the image appeared. This is why psychological work can feel slower than receiving advice. Advice says, do this. A symbol asks, who is the person in you who wants to do this, and who is the person resisting? That question is harder, but it creates depth. Imagine someone who keeps dreaming of missing trains. The easy interpretation is that they are afraid of missing an opportunity.
Maybe. But what if trains for them are connected to childhood separation? What if every dream happens before a major commitment? What if the emotion is not panic, but relief? Now the meaning changes. Perhaps the dream is not about failing to arrive. Perhaps some part of them does not want to go where the conscious personality insists it should. This is why context matters. The psyche is personal before it is theoretical. And when you begin treating symbols this way, you become less dependent on people who claim to decode your life for you. You develop psychological authority. Not the authority of certainty, the authority of relationship with your own inner world. You begin to trust that you can observe something without immediately controlling it. You can allow an image to remain unfinished. You can allow a coincidence to remain mysterious. You can allow a question to remain open. That tolerance for ambiguity is not weakness. It is a form of inner strength.
Because many destructive decisions are made not from ignorance, but from the inability to remain uncertain long enough for a deeper understanding to emerge. Go here. It does not tell you, choose this. Instead, it gives you a question you had never considered, and suddenly your entire problem looks different. That may be more psychologically valuable than an answer, because answers can preserve the person asking the question. A deeper question can transform them. Suppose you have spent months asking, how do I make this person love me? Then something happens that makes you ask, why have I decided that love must be earned? Different question, different psychological world. You ask, how do I become more successful? Then, why does being ordinary frighten me so much? You ask, why does nobody appreciate everything I do? Then, why do I need to be needed? You ask, how do I stop people from leaving? Then, why do I abandon myself whenever I fear someone else will? The external problem may still exist, but now you have reached the structure beneath it. And this is where meaningful experiences can become transformative. They reorganize the question. The psyche was not necessarily trying to give you instructions. It was trying to bring you closer to the hidden problem. This is another place where popular interpretations of Jung can become misleading. People sometimes assume that if something is aligned, it should feel peaceful immediately. If a path belongs to them, everything should flow. If a relationship is right, it should be effortless. If a decision comes from the deeper self, fear should disappear. But individuation is not a comfort program. It is a process in which the personality becomes less divided by making room for what has been excluded. and excluded parts of the self do not always return politely. Sometimes they arrive as exhaustion, sometimes as envy,
Sometimes as boredom with a life that looks successful from the outside.
sometimes as a sudden inability to continue playing a role you once performed effortlessly. You may think something has gone wrong because the old motivations stop working. The praise does not satisfy you the way it used to. The approval you once chased feels strangely empty. The identity that once made you proud begins to feel like a costume. You might interpret this as loss, and in a sense, it is. You are losing a psychological arrangement that once protected you. Maybe being perfect protected you from criticism. Maybe being helpful protected you from rejection. Maybe being invisible protected you from envy. Maybe being independent protected you from needing anyone. Maybe being endlessly positive protected you from anger and grief. These strategies are rarely random. At some point, they probably helped. That is why growth requires compassion for the person you used to be.
The old identity was not stupid. It was adaptive. It solved a problem.
But every adaptation has a cost when it becomes permanent. The child who learned to read the room becomes the adult who cannot relax around other people. The child who earned love through achievement becomes the adult who cannot feel worthy at rest. The child who survived by needing nothing becomes the adult who experiences intimacy as danger. The child who stayed safe by pleasing everyone becomes the adult who feels guilty whenever they say no. Then life begins demanding something different. Not because the universe is punishing you, because the strategy that once protected you is now limiting you. This is the tension of individuation. You are asked to become larger than the identity that kept you safe. And larger does not always feel better at first. It can feel exposed. If you have spent your life avoiding conflict, honesty can feel cruel.
If you have spent your life overworking, rest can feel irresponsible.
If you have spent your life being needed, boundaries can feel like abandonment. If you have spent your life staying small, visibility can feel dangerous. The nervous system may interpret new freedom through the language of old threat. So fear does not automatically mean wrong direction, and excitement does not automatically mean right direction. Both need context. The task is to ask, what kind of fear is this? Is this fear warning me about something real? Or is this the fear of becoming someone my old identity does not know how to be? That distinction cannot always be made in a single moment. It is made through pattern, reality, time, reflection, and sometimes through the willingness to take one small step without demanding a guarantee. Becoming more whole can disrupt your life. Integrating the shadow can threaten your persona.
Developing independence can destabilize relationships built around dependence.
Becoming visible can activate old shame. Setting boundaries can activate guilt. Leaving a collective identity can create loneliness. Speaking honestly can produce conflict. The deeper movement of the psyche does not always say, "This will make you comfortable." Sometimes it says, "This will make you more complete." And completeness can initially feel like disruption. Imagine someone whose entire identity depends on being admired. A meaningful psychological development may require failure. Not because failure is magically destined, but because failure exposes the identity beneath achievement. Who are you when nobody applauds? Another person may define themselves through being indispensable. Their development may require allowing others to solve their own problems. Now they feel useless. Another person identifies with rational control. Their development may require tolerating uncertainty. Now they feel lost. The ego interprets these experiences as regression. But sometimes the old structure has to become unstable before something more integrated can emerge. This is why you should be careful about using comfort as your only compass. Some discomfort warns you away from danger. Other discomfort appears because an old identity is losing control. Learning the difference takes time, observation, and honesty. So what do you actually do when one of these experiences appears? When a pattern repeats, when a dream will not leave you, when someone activates an overwhelming reaction, when an unlikely coincidence feels meaningful, when a symbol begins following a psychological transition. You do not need to immediately decide what it means. First, record it. Write down what happened before memory reshapes it. Then record your emotional state. What were you thinking about? What question was active in your life? What did you feel when the event occurred?
Then ask what associations arise naturally. Not what an internet dictionary says the symbol means. What does it evoke in you? If you dreamed about a forest, what is a forest to you? Freedom? Danger? Childhood? Mystery? Being lost? If someone provoked intense envy, what exactly do they possess that affects you? Beauty? Freedom? Recognition? Discipline? Confidence? If a coincidence involves a former partner, what does that person represent psychologically? Love? Rejection? Youth? Possibility? Abandonment? An unlived future? Then wait. Do not force an interpretation. See whether the theme returns. And most importantly, compare the interpretation with reality. If you believe a coincidence is telling you that someone loves you, what does their actual behavior show? If you believe a dream is telling you to take an opportunity, what are the real risks and facts?
If you believe repeated conflicts means everyone around you is toxic, what happens when you examine your own participation? Meaning and reality should be allowed to speak to each other. That is a much more grounded relationship with the unconscious. You do not reduce life to cold rationalism, but you also do not abandon reason for fantasy. You allow both worlds to meet. And that meeting point is where something genuinely Jungian begins to happen. There is a stage in psychological development when something profound changes. You look back at your life, and patterns become visible. Not because every event was predetermined. We do not always choose what is good for us. We often choose what is recognizable. A chaotic relationship can feel magnetic to someone who learned that love and uncertainty belong together. Emotional distance can feel safe to someone who associates closeness with loss of control. Overwork can feel morally right to someone who learned that rest must be earned. Being overlooked can feel strangely normal to someone who learned early that visibility created conflict. Then the adult says, "Why does this keep happening?" And the answer is not fate in the simplistic sense. It may be that the psyche keeps moving toward unresolved forms because they are familiar enough to be recognized and painful enough to demand attention. This is sometimes called repetition compulsion in psychological traditions, though Jungian language would place special emphasis on complexes, projections, and the autonomous activity of unconscious patterns. Whatever language you use, the experience is recognizable. You know how a situation will probably end, and yet some part of you is pulled toward it. You promise yourself you will choose differently, and then discover the same emotional structure wearing a different face. This is why insight alone is not always enough. You may understand the pattern intellectually and still repeat it emotionally. The body knows familiarity before the conscious mind finishes its analysis. Change, therefore, requires more than naming the pattern. It requires learning to tolerate what initially feels unfamiliar. A calm relationship may feel boring. A respectful boundary may feel selfish. Being appreciated without overperforming may feel suspicious. Receiving help may feel dangerous. Success may feel exposing. Peace may feel empty if your nervous system learned to organize itself around crisis. The new life can feel wrong simply because it is new. This is another reason signs should not become your only compass. If you are unconsciously organized around an old pattern, you may interpret anything familiar as confirmation. The intense person feels destined. The chaotic opportunity feels exciting. The impossible goal feels meaningful because struggle has always been connected to worth.
And then the psyche repeats what it knows.
Consciousness interrupts repetition by making familiarity visible. You begin asking not only, "Do I want this?" but also, "Why does this feel so familiar? What part of my history recognizes this? What would a healthier version of this choice feel like? Would it feel exciting? Or might it feel quieter than I expect?" Those questions begin to loosen fate from habit. Not because every painful experience was secretly designed for your growth, but because you can finally see how your inner world participated in the life you lived. You recognize why certain people fascinated you, why certain situations repeated, why particular losses affected you so deeply, why some opportunities frightened you, why certain symbols appeared during important transitions, why particular dreams stayed with you for years. And slowly, what once looked like disconnected events begins revealing a psychological story.
You see the child who learned to disappear, the adult who repeatedly chose situations where they became invisible. You see the child who learned to earn affection, the adult who became obsessed with unavailable people. You see the young person who buried ambition to remain accepted, the adult who felt irrational resentment toward successful people. You see the person who rejected vulnerability, the repeated dreams of helplessness, the fascination with people who could express emotion freely. The story becomes visible. And when the story becomes visible, fate begins losing some of its power. Because what once seemed like, "This always happens to me," can sometimes become, "This is the psychological pattern I keep entering." That does not mean you caused everything. It means you have discovered the part that can become conscious. And that is the part you can work with. This may be the most important shift in the entire exploration. The goal is not to become someone who sees signs everywhere. The goal is to become someone who needs fewer signs because they have learned to recognize themselves. You notice the projection sooner, the complex sooner, the old attraction sooner, the self-abandonment sooner, the symbolic theme sooner, the tension between persona and deeper life sooner. And when you recognize it, you have a choice. That is where meaning becomes transformation, because awareness without response can become another form of avoidance. You can spend years learning the vocabulary of psychology: shadow, projection, attachment, persona, complex, synchronicity, inner child, individuation, and still use every concept to describe yourself without changing how you live. The language becomes sophisticated. The pattern remains untouched. You know you abandon your boundaries. Then you do it again. You know you chase unavailable people. Then you call the next unavailable person a spiritual connection. You know you silence yourself to avoid conflict. Then you spend hours analyzing why nobody understands you. At some point, consciousness must become behavioral. You say no sooner. You tell the truth sooner. You leave the room sooner. You ask the question sooner. You rest before collapse. You stop checking their profile. You stop interpreting silence. You stop waiting for one more sign. You apply for the opportunity. You make the appointment. You have the difficult conversation. You allow someone to be disappointed. You allow yourself to be seen. This is where psychological work becomes embodied. A pattern loses power not only when you understand where it came from, but when you repeatedly refuse to organize your present around it. And that can feel strangely uneventful. There may be no dramatic sign, no perfect certainty, no moment when fear disappears. You simply notice the old doorway and choose not to walk through it. That choice may look small from the outside. Inside, it can represent years of integration. The person who always over-explains sends the simple message. The person who always rescues lets someone solve their own problem. The person who always waits for permission decides. The person who confuses intensity with love chooses consistency. The person who believes worth must be earned rests without apology. The person who searches constantly for external confirmation
allows a decision to come from values, facts, intuition, and self-knowledge together. This is what freedom often looks like psychologically. Not the absence of old impulses, the ability to recognize them without automatically obeying them. The old attraction may still appear, the old fear may still speak, the old fantasy may still arrive. But now there is a witness. Now there is space. Now there is choice.
And choice is where the future begins to separate from the past.
Perhaps this is the deeper reason certain coincidences, dreams, encounters, and repeating patterns matter. Not because they prove that life has written a secret guarantee for you, but because they interrupt your automatic way of seeing. For a moment, they make the invisible visible. And once something is visible, you can relate to it differently. That is enough. You do not need to turn every strange moment into prophecy. You do not need to force every symbol into a message. You do not need to make every intense connection permanent. Some experiences are meaningful because of what they awaken, not because of what they promise. Some people are important because they reveal a pattern, not because they are meant to stay. Some losses matter because they expose what you had built your identity around. Some dreams matter because they show you an emotion you were refusing to feel. Some coincidences matter because they place your attention exactly where your conscious life had been avoiding it. And sometimes, the greatest sign of growth is that you no longer need the sign to tell you what you already know. Not when the sign appears, when consciousness responds. So perhaps the next time something strangely meaningful happens, you do not need to ask, "Is the universe trying to tell me something?" Try another question. What is this experience revealing in me that I could not see before? And then listen. Not only to the coincidence, not only to the dream, not only to the symbol. Listen to your reaction, your fear, your desire, your resistance, your projection, your history. Because sometimes what feels like a message arriving from somewhere beyond you is also a part of your own psyche, finally becoming visible. And when that happens, the purpose is not prediction. It is consciousness. Perhaps that is why certain moments feel so strangely alive. For one brief instant, the outer event and the inner world seem to touch. And whether you call that synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, or simply a moment that forces you to see yourself differently, the real question remains the same. What will you do with what you can now see? If one sign or repeating pattern from your own life came to mind during this exploration, leave one word in the comments. Dream, pattern, person, symbol, coincidence. You do not have to explain the story. Sometimes naming what keeps returning is enough to begin seeing it consciously. And if you want to continue exploring the hidden patterns, symbols, shadow material, and unconscious forces shaping your life, stay with the kingdom within. Because the unconscious is not somewhere far away. It is present in what attracts you, what disturbs you, what repeats, what you dream, what you avoid. And sometimes, in the coincidence you almost dismissed. The point is not to obey every sign. The point is to become conscious enough to understand why certain signs have the power to stop you in the first place. Because when you understand that, you are no longer simply waiting for life to give you directions. You are learning how to read the deeper life already unfolding within you.